I didn't use the phrase Weimar Republic, because I didn't want to.
Okay, well, pre.
That was me.
Pre. You can.
I used the city. I used Berlin.
That's okay.
Yeah,
You can call it anything you want.
Where does it exist today? I think it exists in numerous places.
Name one.
I live in London. I know London very well. It absolutely exists in London. And I spend a lot of time in Shanghai, have an office in Shanghai, and it absolutely exists in Shanghai. And in that circle of cities, you have the boss wash, I hate that phrase, but the boss wash.
Well,
and
do you
and
see
going from Wuxi, Suzhou, Shanghai down to Hangzhou, I would say that in Jiangsu province corridor is home to an extraordinary range of inventive, creative, innovative people, backed up with a serious amount of money as well.
Do you see it in Manhattan, in any of the areas in the city there?
I would say absolutely Manhattan. Yeah, my father lived in Manhattan for 30 years. An extraordinary, yeah. So, yeah. Have I missed the point of your question?
No, well, the point was, I got the impression from just both sessions that you felt that what you call it intentionality prevails, and that the creativity is dead because most cities and places are trying to make it happen.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know where you thought it was happening.
Intentionality was his phrase, but it's one I absolutely take on board.
It's in your book.
I know. The point of it was that Berlin is a very good example of where governments are trying to do something that doesn't have grassroots, bottom-up activity. The cities we've talked about have grassroots, bottom-up activity, and the role of the London government and the UK government in enabling that, although they take a lot of credit for it, is very, very slight. So it was saying that city government, state government, national government policies have in fact a very limited scope and impact on what we think is important.
Len? Here's the mic.
40 years ago, I was involved in the formation of one of the first venture capital firms in this country. One of the things that drove us was the fear of failure, losing our money. I don't hear anybody talk about it. We talk about protecting people from the mistakes and failures and not letting them fail. What does that do to creativity if you can't fail?
I think that in the creative economy, in these sectors, one fails much more often than one succeeds. And again, that's another reason why governments really find it really hard to cope with it. In my life, I'm failing endlessly, and success is rare. So I don't think that's changed. And I think to have a situation where individuals have enough cash and a good enough education to be able to go out and do what it is they want to do and make a success on their own terms is a very, very important, very important part of the ecosystem. So I'm agreeing with you completely.
Ellen?
That hasn't changed. It shouldn't change.
Ellen?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be taken away by governments who subsidize too much.
Ellen?
Yeah, could you comment on the earlier comment you made about creativity in China and it being a relatively repressive government with a lot of state-owned businesses? How do you account for that?
Sorry, I missed that question.
Creativity in China, being on the upswing in a relatively repressive government with state-owned businesses.
Yeah. Most of the creativity and innovation is coming outside of the state-owned enterprises. Yeah. China it's a funny place, China. And the government, the Beijing government, retains tight control over some. I don't work in TV and film in China because they're so controlled by the state. It's not worth my while doing it. They control that. They control media and businesses that have a mass impact. If you're working to some extent off the radar screen, they give you enormous freedom. And I suspect that the freedom that entrepreneurs that I'm working with in Shanghai and Beijing and Wuxi, I'm not a historian, but I guess it's the same sort of atmosphere you get in Birmingham and Manchester in the 1860s and 1870s, and maybe in Chicago in the 1880s, I don't know. Tremendous freedom, uncontrollable freedom. Both Beijing and the city governments are very, very powerful in China, and they give these guys enormous freedom. Very high levels of corruption, huge population that if you're in charge of concrete or roads or something, you can make a lot of money in a very short space of time. So you get the very heavy and grossly inefficient and impenetrable and state-owned enterprises, but in parallel with that, alongside that, with very complicated shareholding agreements, you get a new breed of companies that are developing very fast indeed.
Can I
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? What do you mean by China? Because, I mean, this is one of those misconceptions of the conditions, that we still work in the frame of nations. Now, do you mean China in its relationship with Hong Kong, China in its relationship with Taiwan, or the biggest expatriate network in the world? I mean, the Chinese economy, when you actually frame it as an expatriate network, is much bigger than anyone else. It's ahead of, I'd suggest, ahead of India, but India would come second. And if I actually then said, what's the American expat network in the world, apart from corporations, which are bureaucratized, very, very low, on the third scale. Now you've got this mega economic machine that owns businesses at 70%, somewhere between 50 and 70% of the small and medium enterprises, all hooked back in this very complex network across Asia. It goes into Canada, it goes into Australia, it goes into, when you start to talk about creativity at that level. And if you want to have an experience of working with the Chinese, go do business in Hong Kong with the Chinese and learn how to do it. I'll give you a very quick example. Fly in at 11 o'clock, meet at 1, 2, 3, go for coffee, come back, 2 of the guys in the meeting have left. They arrive back the next day into the meeting and said, where did they go? Oh, we just flew to London and back to actually take one of the ideas had in the room to put it into what we wanted to do, and we came back. Now, that's what you're dealing with when you're talking about the Chinese. Our experience with General Motors is that, when GM, you've got to see this as a condition. I said this morning it could be stealing, but I don't think it is if you start to have these arrangements into China, you can expect the intellectual property to join up with that system. So, I mean, I say to GM, when I was working with them, they were saying they're stealing our IP. And I say, well, at least you're on the other end of the transaction. Because when they start creating their own IP, they're very, very closed in their networks, and if it's not a cousin, in some cases, then you're not going to get even a cent in the equation.